Chapter 111, A Walk on the Beach, Esau's POV. "We might not find him." Esau comforted himself with that thought as Lord Marcus took a rowboat from the lower deck. The god handed him into the vessel with a strange, courtly gentleness, then lowered it splashing into the black abyss of the sea. Esau's flesh prickled with mingled dread and chill as the spray speckled his bare arms and the ship slipped away above him. Should I have called for help while I still had the chance? He would have... Well, I don't know what he would have done. Anyhow, it's too late now. Something hard butted against his knees. Esau looked up and was only barely able to make out Lord Marcus's silhouette in the darkness as the god handed him the oars. "I'll tell you when to shift course, but just row straight ahead for now," his master ordered. Lord Marcus's voice was genial, even pleased. He'd been so happy ever since he realized what Hanyu had done. His pleasure made Esau feel dizzy and sick with terror, but he reminded himself of the relevant facts as he obediently began rowing away from the ship. "There's no possible way we'll find him." The island would be crawling with gods, including many who would stick by Hanyu's side if they saw him. Hell, anyone from Lord Antony's ship would notice the yellow-haired human and recognize him as their lord's favored pet. Surely they would protect him on Lord Antony's behalf. He might even be gone already. Who knew how long he'd been on the island before Esau woke up and Lord Marcus came searching? As his shoulders began aching from the rowing, Esau reflected privately that his master's plans had little chance of success, whatever they might be. "I must say, I'm a little impressed." Lord Marcus's quiet, musing voice broke into Esau's thoughts. Instantly, all his attention was focused on his master. It was just like it had been when he lived in Lord Marcus's rooms, when that voice ruled his every thought and commanded all his attention, waking or sleeping. He stared at the vague shape of the god's huge shoulders, which blotted out the stars as he leaned towards Esau. "My lord?" he faltered, trembling so hard he was afraid he might drop an oar. "None of my attendants have ever gone whoring themselves out to another master before." Lord Marcus's tone didn't change, but his words sent a jolt of ice through Esau's veins. "None of them dared. I would never have guessed that the first would be you." "My lord," Esau whispered, unsure how he would even begin pleading his case, but his master continued as though he hadn't spoken. "You seem like such an insubstantial milquetoast little thing. There's no one at all behind that oh-so-beautiful face, is there? Just manners and protocols where a personality ought to be. I was too generous when I called you a mouse before. A mouse has some agency. You're more like a shadow or a doll. A lot of pretty nothing." Esau was pierced by a strange sensation, a dull, resigned twin to the feeling he'd had when Lord Julia had given him the shark tooth jewelry. Back then, he'd felt as though Lord Thaddeus truly saw him. Now, Lord Thaddeus was wrong. They all were. Lord Marcus is the only one who's ever seen me clearly. A thing, a pretty toy, empty and hollow. That's why Lord Antony didn't choose me at first, but he still thought he could make me real somehow. Not Lord Marcus. He's always known. Lord Marcus went on conversationally. "So imagine my surprise when a soulless ornament was the first who dared to play me false. As I said, I'm almost impressed. Almost. Still, you must know that I have to punish you." "Oh gods! Oh no! No, 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 no!" Esau kept rowing automatically, but he couldn't restrain a whimper. It felt as if the last 2 punishment-free weeks had pushed him back to being that callow, untried boy Lord Marcus had first claimed. Could a person fall out of practice with pain? He was hardly able to push the required words out past his chattering teeth, but he managed it. "Please punish me as you see fit, my lord." It had never been more vital that he maintain his good manners. He couldn't afford to falter now. "That's my good little doll," Lord Marcus crooned. "Don't stop rowing now." A cold hand ran up Esau's calf, pushing the hem of his robe over his knees and up his thighs. He froze, quivering but continuing the mechanical motion of the oars. "I pulled away when the other gods touched me with their cold hands to soothe and heal me, but with Lord Marcus I don't even flinch. This body must know its true master, even if my stupid mind indulged in all those insipid daydreams. I was always going to be his again." The first cut, sliced into the meat of his upper thigh, made him whimper again. It was a high, plaintive, animal sound that Esau registered with distant disgust. Gods, he was pitiful! The Flavia tooth against his heart felt more like a lie with every passing moment. Lord Marcus went on cutting, whistling jauntily to himself all the while. Esau's blood rolled down his thigh in fat, hot trickles. It soaked his robe and puddled in his groin, beneath his ass, everywhere. He couldn't even feel the pain of the cuts, only the warm dampness of sitting in his own blood. Eventually, the god switched to his other thigh. Esau never stopped rowing. "Bare left, slut," Lord Marcus ordered after an eternity of this. "We're going to dock a little ways away from the others." Quivering, sobbing, Esau obeyed. "If I were like Hanyu and Lord Thaddeus, I would jump off the boat or goad him into killing me. They would never let themselves be used as bait to trap a friend. But I'm a shadow doll, and all I can do is obey." "That's all right, though. We won't find him. Whatever happens, Hanyu will go back to his master's bed in favor. He'll be fine." When they reached the shallows near the island, everything got so much worse. Lord Marcus fitted a rope around Esau's neck and tied it tightly, harnessing him like a camel. Then he ordered Esau to get out of the boat and tow it ashore, and the burn of the salt water in his new cut sent his mind wandering hazily in search of anything else to think of. "Maybe, if I can survive this, Lord Antony will take me again. Maybe he will give me to Lord Thaddeus, and I will sleep in the little bed with the door closed, and dust the fish skeletons, and—" The fantasy extended no further. He knew how ridiculous it was to imagine even that much. Still, it gave him something to feel other than pain and dizzying fear. But that was only the beginning. Lord Marcus led him over the rocky beach, the god's divine vision allowing him to pick his way over and around the stones as Esau could not. He stumbled in his master's wake, his bare feet soon torn and bruised from his endless collisions with the sharp rocks. His wet robe chafed his bloody thighs. 1,000 little hurts merged until every step was dull, grinding agony like he'd never known. Still, he followed, mute and obedient. The god held his leash in loose, careless fingers, clearly not the slightest bit worried that Esau would try to run. He didn't. What chance would he have, barefoot in the dark? All he could do was follow. His world narrowed to endless pain and the tugging of the leash. Every moment was pain, but Lord Marcus's whim decreed whether it would be the dull, predictable pain of another step or the sharp anguish of a jerky stumble. Esau had never felt so abjectly dependent on the god's capricious mercies. By the time he'd followed Lord Marcus in the dark for a quarter of an hour, he was weeping silently, and his attitude was more devout than it had ever been in the past. He had known fear and devotion before, but this was true worship. His master gave the leash a sharp tug, yanking him forward so quickly that he released another feeble moan. This time, however, Lord Marcus was standing still. "Arrest!" Esau dropped heavily to his knees beside his master. Body racked with silent sobs, he leaned forward and pressed a rain of grateful kisses to the god's boots. Esau was so lost in his pain and his worship that he didn't even notice the other presence nearby until he heard an unsteady, horribly familiar voice ask, "Hello? Hanyu." Everything slid back into sharp, merciless focus. From his prostrate position, Esau could just barely make out the flickering orange light of a torch, a pair of heavy boots turning round and round not 2 yards away. Surely he isn't alone. Surely he wouldn't be so foolish. Surely the situation can still be salvaged. Lord Marcus chuckled, the low, syrupy chuckle that Esau had learned to fear more than any other sound in the world, and he couldn't help huddling low over his master's boots, making himself as small as possible. "Hello to you too, little one," Lord Marcus purred. There was a frantic clattering sound. Esau assumed that it must be Hanyu stumbling around, waving his torch to try to see. The god instructed him patiently. "A little forward and to the left. There, that's better, isn't it?" "Esau!" Hanyu gasped, and Esau curled tighter into his ball. "No, no, no. This is all wrong. We were never supposed to find him. Hanyu was supposed to get away. This is all just a nightmare. We just had to join you on this lovely little walk," Lord Marcus drawled. "A little further, I think, past those boulders. The sea makes such a nice background noise, but once we're past those, I think we'll really have some privacy. Won't that be nice?" "We're not going anywhere with you," Hanyu spat, but his voice trembled, and Esau's heart broke at the sound of his fear. "No? What a pity," Lord Marcus sighed. "Then I suppose Esau and I will have to go there and amuse ourselves without you." "Oh, run for help!" The god chuckled again. "No doubt. How fast can you run, do you think? Because I think Esau and I will have time for lots of lovely games before you can bring anyone to join us. I can work very quickly, you know." After a lifetime of willing Hanyu to be silent and submissive, Esau now longed to hear another defiant declaration. There was none. The rough rope around his neck pulled taut. Esau dragged himself to his feet and raised his eyes to his friend's face. Even in the flickering light, made even more erratic by the trembling of the hand that held the torch, he could see that Hanyu was deathly pale. His eyes were huge and shining, his lip quivering suspiciously, and his hand clenched so tightly around a leather satchel that his knuckles were bone white. He looked so small and afraid, so vulnerable as he stood alone in the light. His wide eyes found Esau's. Esau looked at his friend and tried desperately to communicate with only his stare. "Run away. You have so much to hope for, so much to live for. You can't throw all that away for an empty doll." Lord Marcus walked right past him, close enough to brush Hanyu's shoulder with his own, but he didn't. He didn't touch the man at all. He just marched off into the darkness without so much as a backwards glance. Esau limped after him, still holding on to a single ember of hope. It flickered and died when he heard Hanyu's big boots following right behind them. "No, no, no." "Can't you just let Esau go?" Hanyu begged. "I'm here now. I obviously can't get away from you, so—" Lord Marcus sighed. "Oh no, not at all. I have scores to settle with the both of you. We're going to die here." Esau hadn't really believed it until this moment. Even now, the thought was wispy and hard to grasp. His own subjugation to Lord Marcus felt natural and inevitable, but Hanyu's presence made it all seem a little unreal. "Esau hasn't done anything wrong," Hanyu pleaded. "He always wanted to go back to you, but Antony wouldn't let him. It's not his fault." "Antony." Lord Marcus toyed with each syllable of the god's name, seeming to taste it. "He had you using his name before he'd even had you a month, didn't he?" Hanyu's voice quivered with fear and hostility. "He gave me permission the first night you beat him." Esau cowered at the naked rage in Hanyu's tone. "Why can't you control yourself, now of all times? It has never mattered more that you keep it together." But his master only laughed. Hardly the first time, little plaything, he chuckled when his mirth had subsided a bit. Antony belongs to me. He's been mine since your ancestors were killing each other over barren rocks, and he'll be mine long after the sea has taken back your miserable scrap of an island. Did you think you could make him love you? Did you think you could possibly matter to beings like us? Did you honestly think you could ever take him from me? The god's voice rose as he spoke. By the end, he was almost shouting, his voice quivering with hate, and Esau's fingers went involuntarily to the tooth under his robe. He still didn't dare raise his eyes or turn to see Hanyu, but when his friend's voice came, it was no longer angry or even afraid. Instead, it sounded shocked. "No, but you did," Hanyu blurted, and Esau winced, fingers clutching tighter at the tooth. "You wouldn't have gone to all this trouble if you weren't afraid of me." Lord Marcus snarled, a fierce animal sound that turned all Esau's bones to liquid. He might have wet himself then, but he couldn't be sure. "Afraid?" the god seethed. "You insolent, squeaking maggot! You don't know the first thing about fear. But it will be my genuine pleasure to teach you." "We're past the rocky swells," Esau realized dimly. "No one will hear us. As long as I'm alive, Hanyu won't even try to run, even though he's his master's favorite, and he shouldn't be here. Lord Marcus is going to torture us and kill us, and leave our corpses for the crabs, the fish, the sharks." There was no one moment when he decided to do it, and no one reason behind the non-decision. He thought that Hanyu was a favored slave, and while Lord Marcus had every right to dispose of Esau, he was overreaching by slaughtering his lord's prized possession. He thought that maybe Hanyu could make it if Lord Marcus were distracted, and he no longer had to worry about Esau. He thought, in such a brief flash that it was gone before he even moved, that the sharks that would feed on his body would never let themselves be gutted without at least biting back. Esau dropped to his knees at Lord Marcus's feet, an act which didn't even garner a flicker of attention from either of the others. As he'd seen when he was kissing his master's boots, they were thick-soled but thin at the top. Before he had time to rethink, or even to think in the first place, he pulled the Flavia tooth from his robe and stabbed it into the left boot, falling forward so his body weight could accomplish what his weak arms could not. Lord Marcus didn't make a sound or yank his foot away. Esau wasn't sure whether he'd punctured his master's flesh until his leash pulled tight, yanking him up off his feet. The tooth tore free as he was jerked upwards, and he saw in the torchlight that it was dark and shiny. "I made him bleed." The thought was horrifying. There was an edge of something else there, too, another feeling, but he had no time for that. "Hanyu, run!" was all Esau managed to choke out before the leash pulled tight, strangling the last of his words. He dangled before Lord Marcus's face. The god peered at him, dark eyes glinting with some emotion Esau couldn't read. Anger? Irritation? It had to be one of those. Esau clawed at the rope around his throat, mind stuttering between terror and blankness. Lord Marcus's lip curled up, one cheek dimpling softly, and this at last was an expression Esau knew well. Amusement. "You stupid little doll," the god crooned, raising his hand to cradle Esau's face almost lovingly. The agonizing tearing of his master's nails, his knife? When had he drawn a knife? Killed the last conscious thoughts Esau's suffocating brain might otherwise have dredged up, but it wasn't until the god's thumb found his eye that everything went black.